Did the French president calm New Caledonia? Days of riots culminated in a visit from Emmanuel Macron, who has delayed legislation giving French immigrants greater voting rights on the island. Indigenous activists say their influence is deliberately being diluted. So is it time for greater decolonization or even independence? I'm Andrea Sanke, and today's Newsmaker is New Caledonia. French President Emmanuel Macron described the riots in New Caledonia as an unprecedented insurrection movement that took everyone by surprise. During a visit to police headquarters in Noumea, he vowed that France would go until the end to restore order. Protesters burned hundreds of vehicles in riots that left 7 people dead and damaged scores of properties. Tensions have been long-standing between the central government in Paris and indigenous Kanaks, who fear that a new law granting voting rights to French residents living in New Caledonia for more than 10 years will undermine their influence. The pro-independence activists set up roadblocks across the country on May 13th, kicking off the worst violence in 40 years. Macron's brief visit to the island was meant to ease tensions, but he made it clear that order will be restored and French security forces will stay in New Caledonia as long as needed.
In the coming hours and days, massive new operations will be scheduled where necessary, and Republican order in its entirety will be re-established because there is no other choice.
Now, at the heart of the tensions in New Caledonia is the marginalization of the indigenous Kanak people. A 2019 census found the poverty rate among Kanaks was 32%. For non-Kanaks, just 9%. When it comes to education, only 8% of Kanaks have university degrees compared to 54% of white Europeans. And that's despite an agreement reached in 1998 to grant increased political power to New Caledonia and its indigenous population. The Noumea Accord did allow for 3 independence referendums. In the first 2, the Kanak vote was not sufficient to decouple from France. The 3rd referendum in 2021 was held during COVID and boycotted by the Kanaks.
The riots are taking place in urban areas. And in urban areas in Greater Noumea, there are many young people, many families who are marginalized, who have been marginalized. When you arrive in Noumea, there's a contrast. In the same town, you will find places where there are squads. There are people who live without water, without electricity. They live in neighborhoods with social housing, which are far from employment, far from learning and training systems. On the other side of town, we have beaches. It feels like we are on the Côte d'Azur. It's a whole set of things that has brought about the situation. We are getting to a moment when we must recognize the colonial reality, which the current government is not doing, even though the Noumea Agreement was an agreement on decolonization.
Well, New Caledonia is one of 12 overseas territories still controlled by Paris. They are mostly islands scattered around the world in strategic locations and are home to 2.6 million inhabitants. In the Pacific, alongside New Caledonia, France controls the famed holiday destination of French Polynesia, plus the islands of Wallis and Futuna. In the Indian Ocean, France has described itself as an Indo-Pacific resident power, with the islands of Réunion and Mayotte under its control. Perhaps the most surprising of all its territories are the islands of Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, just off the coast of Newfoundland. That's giving France access to rich fishing grounds. And finally, in the Caribbean, France has 4 island territories, as well as French Guiana, which is about the same size as Austria and home to the European Space Agency's spaceport. Well, back in New Caledonia, President Macron did acknowledge the marginalization of the Kanak people, but then left the island with a slight sting in the tail, alluding to their anti-white racism.
We can see today that there is no common vision of the future. We can see that the redistribution of balance has not allowed us to reduce social inequality. It has even increased. And in the discussions that I was able to have with political, economic, civil society leaders, they clearly say that social inequality has continued to go up. And in part, without justifying it, this also feeds a part of the racism that has reappeared in the past 11 days, and in a sort of unprecedented manner due to its uninhibited and open character.
So can New Caledonia find peace with both sides feeling so aggrieved? Well, joining me now to debate that and more are from London, French-Algerian journalist and author of Fixing France, How to Repair a Broken Republic, Nabila Ramdani. And from Canberra, a former Australian diplomat who also served as the head of Australia's mission in Noumea, Denise Fisher. Thanks both so much for being with me. Denise, I'll begin with you because I actually want to get the perspective of a non-French person who knows the island and the region as well as the history, of course. Has President Macron managed this well and shown, he truly understands the grievances of the indigenous Kanak people?
Well, the fact of the President of the Republic coming to Noumea is a gesture in itself. One may well argue that, the territory in the Pacific is French, and so, of course, the President should come. But the reality is that a lot of things that he has done have been based in Paris. As you've reported, the grievances that set off the initial trigger for the riots in the last 10 days was action in Paris to impose a change on voter eligibility, quite a sensitive issue in New Caledonia. And this was taken very badly by independence leaders who are largely indigenous Kanak people. So you're looking here at the intersection of European power and in a Pacific territory with Pacific responses.
Do you think it was necessary, though, to declare, go as far as to declare the state of emergency and to send French reinforcements? Because there was an impression among some that New Caledonia was rather close to civil war.
Well, certainly the extent and the nature of the violence we have not seen in New Caledonia for 40 years. There were 4 years of basically civil disturbances leading up to 1988, when peace agreements were signed, which have prevailed over a largely peaceful environment of this tourist paradise, which we all know in the Pacific. But those peace arrangements are at an end. They ended inconclusively 2 years ago with the 3 independence referendums that you referred to, and including that vitally inconclusive third, supposedly final independence vote, which indigenous people boycotted. The feeling was there that France did not understand its Kanak traditions. The peace agreements say specifically that there must be respect for Kanak culture. It was at the height of COVID. Most of the COVID deaths were being felt in these small communities, which require extensive mourning rites, just for one death, let alone for the 300 they were experiencing. The indigenous leaders asked for a postponement. France persisted. They called for a boycott. So that vote was effectively nullified. They've been calling for another vote. They're refusing to participate in some of the discussions that France has sought to have in the last 2 years. Right. So Mr. Macron was trying from France with this legislation to force discussion. He said this process of changing the French constitution to broaden eligibility of vote finishes by June. If they can't get around a table and agree locally, he would impose it by June. This was extremely badly taken. And you referred earlier to the eruption, the social inequalities. What we've seen is that Kanak leaders who staged demonstrations when this legislation was being discussed in Paris have themselves been surprised by the degeneration to such violence. They called for a suspension of the violence Wednesday last week, and young indigenous Kanaks who have for decades felt alienated from the economic life of the territory have just been continuing to riot, as we've seen.
Yeah, it's interesting, Denise, but Nabila, I'm going to turn to you with this because Denise had mentioned the inconclusive nature of that, especially that third referendum there, and that's the problem. In Paris, that result was not seen as inconclusive. Even though it was boycotted by Kanaks, they had lost hundreds of members of their community to COVID, and yet that referendum went ahead. So now here we are, we've seen this frustration boil out onto the streets. Macron declares a state of emergency. He calls in more French reinforcements. Is this the appropriate response?
Well, as Denise quite rightly said, what really sparked the recent protests and indeed the violence about 10 days ago, it's mainly because the French Parliament was debating contested changes to New Caledonia voter list. Effectively, French members of parliament in Paris approved a bill that will allow residents who have lived in New Caledonia for at least 10 years to cast ballots in provincial elections. Now, opponents fear that this measure will benefit pro-France politicians in New Caledonia and therefore boost the non-Kanak constituency and further the status of the Kanak as a minority with less democratic tools, effectively. And indeed, as they continue to suffer from widespread discrimination already. So the violence was the most severe in New Caledonia since the 1980s, the last time France imposed a state of emergency on the archipelago. But this week, the military flights have evacuated stranded tourists, for example, and the destruction has cost or is costing hundreds of millions of euros. And in the past, Macron's ways to deal with this issue was to facilitate negotiation and indeed dialogue between pro-independence and pro-France factions in New Caledonia. Now, the efforts culminated in 2015 in a referendum, the first of three, but they remain inconclusive. Why? Because the main issue remains.
Right.
Even though tend to vote overwhelmingly for independence, they remain a minority voice.
Yeah. Help us understand, though, Nabila, why does it matter to Paris so much whether French nationals living in New Caledonia can vote in local and provincial elections on the island?
Well, the Paris government and President Macron would argue that it's an issue, first and foremost, of democracy. They would say that to apply the democratic principle is paramount to them, and they will point out that to a built-in majority on the island wanting to remain French. But in real terms, it's a lot more complicated. New Caledonia is potentially strategically a very important air and sea base in the Pacific. The Americans had a huge naval base in Noumea during the Second World War, and the islands have also been a massive reserve in nickel. And now nickel mining in New Caledonia is a major sector of the economy, along with tourism. The island contains some 7.1 million tons of nickel reserves, which is about 10% of the world's total. And the industry accounts for almost 25% of private employment. Now, nickel is, of course, crucial to electricity, and so much of the world now is going electric. So that's why there are also claims that Russia is trying to move in on New Caledonia via Azerbaijan, while China is also very interested in opening it up as a sphere of influence. And France clearly wants to resist this,
right,
just as it has tried to resist other countries moving in on its former colonies in Africa, such as Niger and Mali.
The nickel issue is especially important in electric batteries for the electric vehicles that we're seeing a booming market in. So there's potentially even more money to be made. That's mostly going to be in the hands of French companies. But Nabila, let me ask you one final question before I come back to Denise. Do you see parallels here with Algeria in that there is an indigenous population that feels completely marginalized and discriminated against, yet France, as a colonial power, will not let go?
Yes, absolutely. The parallels are very striking, and all this latest eruption of violence has to be seen in the wider colonial context. The modern history of New Caledonia is a colonial history, and this is really all an extension of the kind of decolonisation movements that started to develop after the Second World War. France lost much of its colonial empire in the 1950s and indeed the 1960s, but has been hanging on to some of it, not least through its overseas territories. So these are some 12 or 13 around the world, and New Caledonia, which is a group of islands in the Pacific Ocean, is one of the most prominent. And the indigenous people there are a group of clans known as the Kanak, and they form around 40% of the indigenous population of around 280,000 people. And they have been living on their land for over 30,000 years. So I guess you would compare them to the Native Americans in North America, for example, as well. They were, the Kanaks were in New Caledonia long before British navigator James Cook landed, and he named the land after Scotland. He thought it looked like Caledonia, the Highlands of Scotland. And French colonialism came relatively recently with Napoleon III in the 1850s, and settlers and other colonists from mainland France have been going on living there ever since. And France was even deporting convicts from the mainland.
I asked about Algeria, though, specifically, though, because there was, in the end, there was a bloody war fought that went on for so many years before France finally just had to say, okay, we need to leave.
Yeah. With Algeria is France also deported even thousands of Algerians who rebelled against French colonial rule to New Caledonia. And between 1864 and 1921, more than 2,000 Algerians who were against colonial rule on their own land were deported to New Caledonia. So this process of decolonization also, just like in Algeria, involved strict segregation policies with native Kanaks who were forced into reservations, for example. And by 1902, the Kanaks were restricted to some 10% only of their land on the main archipelago, making them an oppressed minority on their own lands. And this is a parallel that has been experienced by all colonized peoples within the French Empire, including Algerians, more strikingly so.
Right. Let me ask Denise, Macron, he came saying, well, this is a question of democracy, as Nabila noted. He also says he came with lots, and I'm quoting him, lots of respect and humility. Help us kind of understand if the Kanak people in particular find Macron and the French, for that matter, humble in their approach toward the indigenous peoples, or is there this feeling of the past discrimination still manifesting in a sort of kind of arrogance today?
I think that one of the most important comments Mr. Macron made when he landed, immediately after he landed, was to say that he had come with determination to stand side by side with the people and with humility and respect. And I think in the Pacific context, these concepts are extremely important. He also said he came to listen. And in the Pacific Island context, that is extremely important. So it is a first step, I think they would see it. They did come to a meeting with him. They still declined to meet together with the loyalist parties, as they have for the last 2 years. But they did meet with him, which is something they didn't do when he came in July to talk to them. They shunned his meeting. So this time, at least, the fact that they came to and listened to his what he had to say and to what he was offering. He has also, in his declaration before he headed back to Paris, he was 18 hours in the territory. He did hit a couple of the things that they had asked for. He talked about certainly restoring, in the first instance, restoring order, law and order, and he pleaded to them. He said he put the onus on them to again call for an end to the violence from their people. That's a big condition, but he did say that he would not force through this legislation that is taking place in Paris. He wanted to give time for more dialogue. Now, in the Pacific sense, this is extremely important, to take time to talk. He left a dialogue mission behind after he left. This is one of the requests that the indigenous leaders had made. And he did talk about another self-determination vote as part of the overall solution, which again, they have been calling for another vote. So he did hit a number of things they had asked for, but we do have to wait. Responded all day today. We've just finished Friday, and normally there would be a response. There's notable that we have had no official response from the indigenous leaders.
Yeah. And tell us in the meantime, I mean, how important, we alluded to some of this, but how important this issue really is to Australia, who considers this part of the world its own backyard of sorts. And, if New Caledonia, for example, declared independence and China, starts to look to create stronger ties, similar to what it has done with the Solomon Islands, for example, where would that leave Canberra?
Well, just to note that New Caledonia already, as Australia indeed has already got very substantial ties with China. New Caledonia was the fourth largest exporter of nickel globally last year, and its principal market, of course, is China, as it is for Australia. And there is Chinese investment in a joint venture with one of the nickel factories in New Caledonia, just as there is in Australia with our industry. So dealing with China, it's not unusual for us in this part of the world. China is our major trading partner. But I think obviously Canberra, Australia, the Australian government has supported the 40 years of peace agreements, as indeed have the Pacific Island nations. We're a member of the Pacific Island Forum, and we all have been supporting the 40 years of peace agreements while closely watching how they've been implemented. We've all remained in the Pacific tradition fairly quietly supportive of this, expecting the parties to address the final stage, consistent with the principles they signed on to. But the violence of the last week has led an end to this silence. The Australian Prime Minister made the highest possible statement in 30, 40 years that I've heard from an Australian government on New Caledonia, saying we're watching it very closely. It's very preoccupying for us. And other Pacific Island leaders have also made high-level statements, including the head of the Pacific Island Forum. So the eyes are on France, the eyes of the region, which have been discreet for the last 40 years. They are now on France as to how it resolves this issue. Nabila mentioned the important strategic role that New Caledonia has for Australia particularly. It's our closest neighbour off the east coast of Brisbane, our Queensland state. In World War II, it was known as the aircraft carrier off the coast of Queensland because the Americans set up their base for battles of Midway, Guadalcanal, Coral Sea, which protected Australia and which formed the basis of the US strategic alliance, which is fundamental and primordial for successive Australian governments ever since. So it's a strategically very important place, straddles our main economic routes.
Indeed. Nabila, let me come back to you, though, and if you can speak closer to perhaps what the Algerian experience was as well, and other former colonies of France that France had to pull out of. There's a question, especially among the loyalists in New Caledonia, about how well New Caledonia could do as an independent country, how well it could survive without the French presence there in the business, in imports, in institutions. What would that landscape look like if France were to have to suddenly leave on somewhat acrimonious terms?
Well, I think the crux of the matter here is self-determination. It's whether or not the indigenous population of New Caledonia wants to go it alone or not. And at the moment, the United Nations is declaring that New Caledonia is a non-autonomous territory to decolonize. So I guess any resolution to this crisis, as anywhere in the world, would be self-determination. That will be the ultimate resolution. In the end, indigenous population should be offered respect and justice in their own nations. And what that doesn't happen, when you get and when that doesn't happen, then you get serious trouble, as we are currently seeing in many parts of the world right now. And,
I mean, France is unusual in that it has so many overseas territories that are very similar to colonies. In fact, some say this overseas territories is just a modern word for colonies, but it's basically the same thing. And it seems to keep breeding these troubled relationships between indigenous peoples and French authorities. Can it continue indefinitely?
Well, certainly pro-independence activists and indigenous people in New Caledonia view Macron's latest move in his attempt to reform the voting system as a new form of colonization, as a continuation of that colonization process. And in Kanak culture, in Kanak's identity, land is a hugely important aspect of it all. You know, they are indigenous people who shouldn't technically have anything to do with Europe unless they choose to do so. They speak their own languages, they have their own system, of belief. They produce their own music, their own art and literature, and they're very proud of this very distinct identity. And crucially, land is a huge aspect of their sovereignty in their quest for self-determination and autonomy. There have been decades of tensions over this issue of independence between the Kanaks and indeed the descendants of colonists and other who settled in the territories, who want to remain part of France. So I think trying to unbalance the reform system further to the advantage of non-Kanaks is a clear sign of France deliberately wanting to hang on to its overseas territory.
Okay, Nabila, that will have to be the final word. And a quick note, I must say to our viewers, I thank you both for carrying this conversation. We did have two other guests, one from the New Caledonian government, as well as another French loyalist politician. Unfortunately, they couldn't make it, but I'd like to thank both of you so much for being with us on this edition of the Newsmakers. Greatly appreciated. Our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter or X, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And Andrea, Sanke, we'll see you next time.